Everybody, it is Thursday in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. My name is Adam Bittner, assistant sports editor for multimedia at the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette, joined for our weekly Penn State football chat by Joel Haas, Nittany Lions insider for both the Post-Gazette and the Daily Collegian. We got a lot to talk about this week. KJ Winston goes down with a, quote, long-term injury. Never really know what that means in Penn State land, but I suppose we will find out. Talking about Kent State, obviously they got their butts kicked pretty badly last week against Tennessee. What does that mean for Penn State going into the week? Some talk about Bill O'Brien with the success he's having at Boston College and how much James Franklin is paying attention to that. Getting into a little bit of headset communications that's come up a couple of times, not just at Penn State, but around college football, whether those in-helmet signals are working or not in some circumstances. We'll wrap up talking a little Pitt and Penn State volleyball. Huge match last night at the Peterson Event Center. Penn State loses 3-0. So lots to get to this week. Before we do, just want to thank our sponsor for this episode of the podcast, Voodoo Brewing State College. Enjoy world-renowned craft beer, delicious cocktails, and our almost famous lobster rolls at Voodoo Brewing Company, State College Pub, located right off College Avenue and Route 322 at 201 Elmwood Street, State College. VBC has something exciting going on every day of the week. Join us this fall on Mondays for our weekly free play cornhole tournaments, or test your knowledge with pub trivia every Tuesday at 6. Wednesday is our game night featuring board games, card games, and adult games. Every Thursday, your boy Dots hosts bingo, and this is not your Nana's bingo. Saturday, we have your Nittany Lions and college football on all day. We finish off Sundays with our weekly brunch, paired with Steelers, Eagles, and Red Zone coverage. Can't wait to see you at the VBC State College Pub. All right, Joel, let's get into this with KJ Winston. What's the real impact here? Because we've talked on this show about how strong Penn State is at safety with Reed and with Zakee Wheatley. So do you think this is an injury Penn State can weather, or do you think KJ Winston was such a dynamic player that it's going to impact the defense regardless of whether those two guys behind him continue to play well?
Yeah, I mean, it's obviously a big injury, a big loss for Penn State. You never want to lose a guy who, according to some outlets, was a projected first-round pick and pretty much across the board is considered one of the top safeties in college football. So, no matter how much depth you have at that position, you never kind of want to see that if you're Penn State. And again, James Franklin, very vague on the timeline. Actually, only gave us 2 words. He got asked if he had any update about KJ Winston. He said long term, and then we moved to the next question. So we put out as much information as we got there, but that's all Franklin was willing to say, which typically means multiple games, not necessarily a season-ending injury. It could be. There's the potential for him to still come back later in the year, but it looks like for at least the next few games, he'll be out. Which like you mentioned, Penn State does have some solid players at the position. And so I think they have, with Jaylen Reed and with Zakee Wheatley, they have 2 good safeties right there who have looked really good throughout the first 2 weeks of the season. And so I think, they are pretty solid at safety. The big question is, what do they do with that Lion position? And frankly, kind of got into that a little bit yesterday. And I think what the plan is actually to move Jaylen Reed from the Lion role back to a full-time safety. Keep him kind of over the top instead of bringing him down every once in a while into the box. And then instead, I think they want to bring Cam Miller, who's a cornerback, into the Lion position. So there will be a few guys getting kind of shuffled around there, but they're still sticking with kind of that 5 defensive back look. It'll just be Cam Miller manning the Lion position with Jaylen Reed going back to safety, which I think just says what that tells me is that they feel more confident in the cornerback depth at this point than, whoever the next man up would be at safety. I think the transfer of King Mack really hurts Penn State there. He was a top 100 recruit who looked like he was on the 2 deep. He would probably have been that 4th guy who would be able to step in, but transfers back to his home state, transfers to Alabama over the offseason. And so Penn State kind of took a hit there. I think that definitely plays a role because I think he probably would have been the guy that you look to in this situation. But regardless, they transitioned to Cam Miller playing that Lion role. They bring Jaylen Reed back up high. And so Penn State, obviously will look a little bit different in the secondary, but at the end of the day, it should still be a talented group. Obviously, they're going to take a slight step back, but I think they'll be able to maintain still, that kind of elite status.
You think they're going to keep the game plan, pretty similar and not, because of sometimes sub-package situations, you end up calling things differently because of the personnel you have available. But it sounds to me like you're still expecting that 5 DB package to be, what we see by and large.
Yeah, definitely.
You mentioned that it's not clear exactly what long-term means in this circumstance. I think Franklin traditionally says longer term when he means not just multiple games, but probably at least 6 and sometimes a season-threatening injury. But, he seemed very hesitant to get to this point. He was asked about it on Monday and demurred and said he didn't want to answer the question, said he'd get back to it later in the week. So there must have been some hope at some point along the way that he might be available this week or somewhat soon. Maybe if not this week, then maybe for Illinois next week. What is your speculative read on, Franklinology here and like what he says versus what he means? To me, I'm kind of getting what you hinted at the beginning of this. Probably is not season ending, but it's not going to be an overnight week to week thing either.
Yeah, it can be really difficult to read Franklin. Especially the way that you kind of, pose the question to him regarding an injury. You have to be very careful about the wording, and kind of the way that you ask it if you really want to get him to answer. But he'll tell you if it's a long-term injury, which again we can't really define that necessarily. But like you said, probably at least 6 weeks or so kind of feels like the time range there. If it's a short-term injury, he just kind of won't say anything at all. But yeah, like you said, he was asked about it earlier in the week on Monday and deferred, kind of said, he was waiting to get more information. I think most likely he was waiting for some kind of diagnosis. He didn't want to put out some misinformation or anything like that. So he kind of pushed it back a few days and then, told us yesterday that it would be long-term. But yeah, I think if you're Penn State, realistically, this next stretch of games, you might be okay. You should be able to survive Kent State, Illinois, UCLA. And then after that, it gets a little bit tougher. I think that's when you're kind of hoping Winston can come back, especially for USC, Ohio State, teams with those high-powered offenses, especially very strong passing attacks. That's where you kind of get a little bit worried. But, we really don't have any sort of timetable for this. It could be, there's a very wide range of weeks for him coming back. But, yeah, I definitely wouldn't expect it anytime soon.
Another thing that came up at the Franklin news conference this week was the in-headset or in-helmet communication and how they've been having trouble with it, particularly on defense at home, because obviously, when you're at home and on defense, you want the crowd to be bringing the noise, you want them to be loud. But he said they were having trouble getting things in because the players couldn't hear in the headset. We've heard that all around college football. I've seen, how many of these, you've seen it in the NFL before, but they seem to have figured it out better than college football, where every quarterback every weekend now I see is doing this, trying to hear what's being said. And it's going to be difficult, I think, particularly on defense, because this was just Penn State versus Bowling Green, a couple weeks ago. This was not, it was not a situation where it should be that loud. I think probably the crowd was probably a little louder than normal for a MAC game, considering, Bowling Green was in the game for as long as it was, but it's still not going to compare to the noise for an Ohio State game or the whiteout against Washington later in the year. How big a concern is the technology for the way defenses and offenses to, another degree, how they're doing business right now?
Yeah, so I think you kind of nailed it. I think going into this, a lot of people were kind of worried about, the offense. That's what most people were thinking about, getting the plays in and kind of passing that information from the quarterback to all the players. But what people kind of failed to consider was how loud it would be defensively, which is really interesting because it's like, what do you do if you're Penn State, where you obviously have one of the best home environments in the sport? Are you going to tell them to, be quiet so the defense can hear? Like, you obviously don't want to do that. But it does bring up some kind of difficulties that I think a lot of people weren't anticipating, because a lot of people kind of forgot about that defensive side of the ball, how they also, have the in-helmet technology. We know they've been using, I think Kobe King has been doing it, and then when he goes out, it's been Tyler Elsdon, so the Mike linebacker, which obviously makes sense because they're typically in charge of the defense. But yeah, it just kind of adds an extra wrinkle. They've all, even before in-helmet communication, it was a thing that they would do, but just kind of not at the scale. I think, they would kind of give the front the look to the defensive line, but they didn't have to worry about the defensive backs. Whereas now they're kind of communicating more with they have to turn around and give the calls to the defensive backs as well, which just kind of adds an extra layer, and it's just another opportunity for things to go wrong. I kind of wonder if that ever popped up really in that Bowling Green game. I wonder if that was maybe a reason during the first half for some of the difficulties. I think Kobe King did mention that briefly after the game, how it did kind of play a role with just kind of getting those calls out. So it is really interesting, and it's a tricky situation because it's like you can't just ask the crowd to be quieter. You kind of have to adapt. So it'll be interesting to see what they do there defensively to kind of adjust to that. But I mean, if it's that difficult for Penn State's defense, you have to imagine it's also very difficult for the opposing offenses to get the calls in and things like that. But I think it's just something that will kind of take a learning curve. I think they'll be able to kind of figure out strategies to get maybe a little bit better at that moving forward, because it's obviously new technology this year that they're not really used to. So it'll be interesting to see what they do with that moving forward. But they've definitely talked about, Franklin went a little bit in depth about that, about kind of all the difficulties that it's brought up specifically for the defense.
Let's get into Kent State a little bit. And Joel, I think this might be one of the worst teams Penn State's faced in my lifetime on paper, just in terms of, listen to the way things have gone for them. They lose 55-24 to Pitt in week 1. Obviously scored a few points, but I think Pitt was still figuring some things out. It's week 1. I don't know how much you can put into that. And then 2 weeks ago against St. Francis, they lose 23-17. St. Francis is an FCS school, so not even in the same division as the Golden Flashes. And then last week at Tennessee, incredibly bleak. They lose 71-0. And honestly, Joel, I think if Tennessee had wanted to, they could have won that game 100-0. In terms of what that means for Penn State, if there's any sign of weakness here, are you throwing red flags all over the place about the Nittany Lions, just considering that this is not just a MAC school? I think it's a really crappy one. They're last in offense and last in defense statistically too in FBS.
Right. Yeah. No, I think if you have any sort of issue at all in this game, it's a big red flag. It's a big reason for concern. I mean, if you're Penn State, you're kind of expecting dominance on every level. Offense, defense, special teams, every position group. You kind of want to see dominating this game. I mean, like you mentioned, what they've been able to do so far this season, 0-3 with some pretty terrible losses in there. I know Tennessee had like a record-setting day. I think they broke their program record for points in a quarter in that first quarter, and the spread going into that game I think was 49, and Tennessee ended up covering by halftime and kind of just took the foot off the pedal a little bit, but still cruised to 71-0 victory. And so, I mean, if you're Penn State, you probably consider yourself in the same tier as Tennessee, somewhere around that range. Certainly, the AP poll kind of puts them in that same tier as well. So if you're Penn State, you're kind of expecting a similar result here where you should be able to get in some work for the backups and things like that. This shouldn't be, a very interesting game. I mean, you look at what happened with Bowling Green, and obviously, you have to come prepared every week, and you can't slip up or anything like that. But I think Bowling Green is just, on a completely different level compared to Kent State, because, not only are they an MAC school, but they're, one of the better MAC schools compared to Kent State, who finished 1-11 last year, has started 0-3 this year, might go 0-12 this year, looking at the remainder of their schedule. I mean, it's just a completely different level of caliber of team. So yeah, I mean, if you're Penn State here, if you're anything short of completely dominant in this game, I think that's a little bit concerning when you add that on top of kind of the struggles against Bowling Green.
Yeah, and I think the final score matters less than how does that whole first half go. Or if you're, where you're supposed to be at the end of the first half and things get bogged down in the second half, I think you live with that, right? But especially in the first half, it's got to be dominant for people not to be concerned about this team with the teeth of the conference schedule looming not too far away. Joel, I also wanted to ask who you're interested to see play this week. Let's just assume the first team goes out there, gets out to 4, 5, 6 touchdown lead at halftime, and it's time to bring in the reserves. Are there any names on your list that you're curious to see in some meaningful action for the first time?
Yeah, well, I think we might get to see Ethan Grunkemeyer for the first time, which would be pretty big. Obviously, always looking forward to quarterback as, the most important position on the field. You kind of want to know what Penn State has there behind Drew and Bo, who we've kind of seen what they are. And at this point, they're kind of proven commodities. I'm interested to see, if Grunkemeyer can get into the game, even get some meaningful snaps, maybe a few drives there toward the end of the game, kind of what he's able to do. And then looking at kind of some of the other younger guys, I think like Tyser Denmark at wide receiver. I kind of want to see what he's able to do just to kind of get a feel for the future of Penn State's wide receiver room and what they're able to do there. Defensively, Dejon Lane, who's played a little bit and has been given the green light by James Franklin to burn his red shirt. So he was probably going to play regardless of opponent, but I would still be very interesting. I think he'll get, more snaps this week than what we've seen. So I'll be interested to see kind of what we get from him. A guy like Max Granville comes to mind who, reclassified up a year to come to Penn State early, and we've heard great things about how he's been able to fit in already and hit the ground running, really looking good and impressing the staff and everything like that. Even though he's obviously a year younger than even all of the freshmen, so I'd be interested to kind of see a lot of those younger guys, a lot of those freshmen who should be able to get some meaningful snaps. If they're not getting on the field this week, I'd be a little bit concerned.
Yeah, keep an eye on those guys as things especially get into the second half, and you're looking for a reason to continue to care. Those are the guys you want to see. I'm curious to see how that shakes out as well. Joel, let's get into Illinois a little bit. They're ranked this week. I think we didn't look at that as a huge game for Penn State when the schedule came out, but they're ranked this week. They're going into a ranked matchup at Nebraska. They're a touchdown underdog. They have a ranked win against Kansas, although Kansas is now 1-2. So I don't know how much stock you can put into that. How legit are you looking at Illinois as going into this week against Nebraska? And are they a team that we need to be concerned about being a sneaky game on Penn State's schedule like they were a few years ago when they won in 9 overtimes at Beaver Stadium? Or are they just an easy team for people who are trying to figure out how to fill out the poll on Sunday morning to just kind of classify, let's put Illinois in there at the bottom. They got a ranked one in there, undefeated.
Yeah, I think part of their ranking definitely goes back to their win over Kansas, which I think Kansas was 19 at the time, and as we've seen now, they're sitting at 1-2, and they haven't really looked the same as they have the last couple of years. Part of that you could say is Andy Kotelnicki not being there anymore. I think that definitely plays a role. I think if Kansas hadn't been ranked, I don't think Illinois would be ranked because they wouldn't have that ranked win. But regardless, they're heading into a pretty big matchup this weekend against Nebraska. I think I would call it their first real, true test to kind of see how legit this team is. But I think this is just a classic Brett Bielema team. We've kind of seen what he's been able to do over the years where, there's low expectations heading into the season. And it's just a bunch of, 3-star guys, kind of under the radar guys. But they, they play hard, they play disciplined. They kind of drag you down into the mud with them and slow the game down, limit possessions, things like that. That's how, Illinois was able to beat Penn State, like you mentioned, a couple years ago in Beaver Stadium. Obviously, I think they'll try and follow kind of that same game plan. I don't know if they'll be able to do it this year. I think that Penn State's offense will be a lot better than it was, a couple years ago, and that might kind of save Penn State from getting, dragged down into one of those, tougher, low-scoring games. But yeah, I think Illinois is a team that especially, any team under Brett Bielema, I feel like you have to take seriously. Penn State will get a better look into what Illinois really is against Nebraska, because I'm pretty high on Nebraska and what they've been able to do so far. With Dylan Raiola and Matt Rhule, I think that they're kind of, that they should at least make a bowl game for the first time in however many years. But I think Nebraska will be a pretty solid team. So I do think this will be a big test for Illinois. I'm interested to see what happened. Like you mentioned, Nebraska is about a touchdown favorite right now. So, potentially Illinois, if things hold kind of how they're expected to go, Illinois should lose this game and then probably will be unranked heading into Penn State. But if they are able to pull off a win, that's technically Illinois' second ranked win. They'll probably get bumped up in the rankings, and all of a sudden that game against Penn State looks a lot bigger. So I think this weekend will tell us kind of a lot more. But, as always, it's an Illinois team coached by Brett Bielema. It's you can't sleepwalk through that one.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you about Nebraska too, Joel, because Matt Rhule is kind of a wet dream for a lot of Penn State fans who yearn to move on from James Franklin despite his success. Obviously, he hasn't gotten to the next level, but there's a large segment of this fan base that believes Matt Rhule is the guy because he played for Joe Paterno, and that's the coin of the realm for a good chunk of people. For that reason, I think I've always kind of looked down my nose at Matt Rhule a little bit, just because I'm the type of person who's sick of, a decade after Joe Paterno still sitting here and talking about the program being defined by him, and anyone who ever knew him or met him. That's kind of my feeling about Matt Rhule. But what's your read? I guess I have a little bit of a thing about Dylan Raiola doing the Patrick Mahomes cosplay every week. How much of that is feeding into the hype for this program, where it's just he's in all these TikToks and Instagram reel clips, and people are talking about him because of the cosplay he does rather than necessarily the results?
Yeah. So I'll start with the Matt Rhule part first. Obviously, covering Penn State, I'm not extremely dialed into everything that's going on there, but being a Big Ten team, I still kind of have to keep up with everything that's going on there. And I got to listen to him talk at Big Ten Media Days. I think he went right before Franklin did, and I thought he was really well spoken. I kind of just listening to him, I could kind of understand. This is why people want to play for him. This is why recruits want to play for him. I think he's a great speaker, kind of a great motivator, and so I kind of do understand the appeal of playing for Matt Rhule, and everything like that. I can kind of understand why he would be able to turn the program around, and we've seen him do it before. I think it was Temple, Baylor. Where he comes in kind of a rebuild situation, has a poor first year, and then his second year is where the team really explodes. So I mean, if he's following that pattern once more, obviously this is the year for Nebraska to kind of explode. And so far, again, they've looked good, undefeated so far, and they're currently ranked with a chance to beat a ranked opponent. So I do kind of buy into that hype. Like I said a little bit earlier, I'm a little bit high on kind of Nebraska and what they're able to do. A lot of it does stem to Dylan Raiola, Patrick Mahomes Jr., which just a really a really interesting thing there. I mean, I believe he was the number one ranked quarterback recruit in his class, and I feel like when you're that good, when you're a 5-star quarterback and the top quarterback in your class, I feel like you don't need to be kind of pulling out these gimmicks to like you don't have to be doing that to kind of get all this attention and bring in kind of the media and things like that. I feel like he would probably be able to bring in enough attention already just by being an elite quarterback. But it's been really interesting to see. I mean, there's been some jokes I've heard about, he I think originally committed to Ohio State, flipped to Georgia, and then after Georgia flipped to Nebraska. And I've heard the jokes about, he only switched from Georgia to Nebraska because the red is a little bit closer to the Chiefs red. He looks a little bit more like Mahomes at Nebraska. But yeah, no, it's definitely weird to see just kind of those gimmicks that he's been doing. But you know what, if that's what he wants to do and it's not impacting his play, I guess, more power to him.
Yeah, I don't know. There's a substance question there. And I think especially when you consider that the biggest win they have this season is against the king of lack of substance being Colorado, Shedeur Sanders and their act. So I'll be curious to see how they play in a game against a Big Ten opponent, under the lights, under the bright lights. I agree with you. I think they'll probably win, but I'm not quite sure I'm ready to declare Matt Rhule the next Penn State football coach quite yet. We'll still have to see how things unfold there. Let's get into the Bill O'Brien question that James Franklin got this week, talking around college football as well. I've always sensed a little bit of frost in that relationship and in those comments. James Franklin said the right things. He pointed out how they, worked together at Maryland, and how their wives were good friends. He didn't say that he and Billy were good friends. And then just it stopped a little bit short of all-out praise for the guy. You were in the room. What was the tone there? And do you sense a little bit of frost there as well?
I think that's fair to say. I think with James, he's always very careful with kind of the wording of his statements, but at the same time, he never wants to give anyone, kind of any bulletin board material. He doesn't want to really rub anyone the wrong way. He's always very complimentary. A good example of that is actually this week during his press conference, kind of previewing the Kent State matchup, which he does, for every game, but he'll list kind of a couple players on the team that kind of worry him, as guys that Penn State's kind of watching. for the opposing team. And he'll usually give maybe 2 on offense, 2 on defense. I think for Kent State, he listed like 9 or 10 guys, which is way more than he's listed for any team. It also happens to be the worst team on the schedule, which I thought was funny because he's always just trying to avoid insulting anyone. But, if you do want to pick up on things like that, you kind of have to read between the lines. I think I do kind of agree with what you said. I think I don't know if he necessarily, likes Bill O'Brien or views him as a friend, but I do think he kind of respects him as a football coach, at least on that level and what he's been able to do. I do think he does, at least respect Bill O'Brien on that level with what he's been able to do so far at Boston College, which has been pretty impressive.
Yeah, I think it's just so interesting because those guys kind of share the greatest career achievement to this point of pulling Penn State out of the sanction era, keeping it from going off the cliff after the Sandusky scandal. But there's never seemed to be a ton of love there, even though they kind of have that achievement in common. So, just interesting to see how far Boston College can go this year. Can they be a relevant player in the ACC? We talk about it on the Paul Zeiss show. The ACC is wide open. Why not Bill O'Brien making some noise with a team that's already fairly battle tested for early in the season, beats Florida State, slays them, and then goes to Missouri, and I think played a pretty solid game, even though they lose, but that doesn't count toward the conference standings. So I'm definitely going to be watching Boston College much closer than I otherwise would have been because of Bill O'Brien. Let's wrap the show on this, Joel. Penn State loses to Pitt in volleyball on Wednesday night. Pitt was ranked number 1, Penn State ranked number 3. Pitt gets a great home crowd of nearly 12,000 at the Peterson Event Center. It was electric, and Penn State did not kind of rise to that moment. They were fairly well dominated. I think they led in the second set for a little bit, for a couple of points, and then otherwise Pitt just kind of ran over them. Penn State's the number 3 team in the country. Joel, do you still think that they have a chance to compete for a national championship this season? And I think the bigger picture question is, what happened? How did we get here from the dynasty of Russ Rose and those numerous national championships going back to when I was in school and even a little bit after, to now you've been surpassed, I think it's fair to say, as the best volleyball team in the state by Pitt?
Yeah, well, first of all, shout out to volleyball for actually scheduling Pitt. Great in-state rivalry there that for some reason the football team seems like it's been avoiding, even though a lot of other teams, I think of baseball, softball that will play Pitt every year. But going back to your question, I mean, if you're Penn State, obviously it's kind of a very demoralizing loss, getting swept 3-0. It felt like they were never really in that match. Like you mentioned, they, barely led at all, maybe just a little bit in that second set, but that was really it. If you're Penn State, I think that match kind of shows you that you're not necessarily on that elite level. They had a good season up to that point. Obviously, they were ranked. Penn State was ranked number 3 in the country. They had, an 8-0 record heading into the game. I think a couple ranked wins there as well. But heading into that Pitt matchup, obviously riding high, you're hoping for at least a closer, more competitive game. I think if it was maybe a 3-2 Pitt win, then you kind of think, okay, Penn State, showed that it can still be competitive against this type of team. But obviously they kind of looked outclassed for the entirety of that match. And I think if you're projecting forward, I mean, they would need some kind of major turnaround. I mean, potentially they can get hot, or maybe the tournament just lines up in a way where they end up getting lucky and playing some of the lower teams because of upsets or something like that. So I wouldn't say it's completely out of the cards, but kind of based on that result, I don't think Penn State will really be in contention for a title this year. I think they'll still be a solid team as they have been, but yeah, it feels like ever since Russ Rose retired and Shoemaker Colley took over again, they've been a pretty solid team, I would say, over the last couple of years under Shoemaker Colley, and a lot of that is probably due to the team's history. I think it's pretty easy to recruit to Penn State when you have the kind of history, of championships and wins and everything like that they have. But yeah, we've seen almost, I don't want to call it a slow decline, but that's kind of what it feels like ever since Rose retired. And Shoemaker Colley has had to kind of, recruit her own players to come in, and instead of the players that Rose already had on the team. And it feels like the team has been almost in a slow decline, but they're still kind of hanging on, as still, like a top, I don't know, 15-ish team in the country, it almost feels to me kind of reminiscent of what Clemson football has been over the last few years, where, they obviously reached those heights of national championships. And then ever since, they've just kind of slowly dropped down in record ever since. And they've been, a ranked team pretty much every year. But Penn State kind of gives me those vibes where it still feels like a solid team. But I think that matchup, more than anything, that matchup against Pitt kind of tells you that they're not on that elite tier.
Yeah, I think a decade ago you might have said, well, they lose this game, they go into the Big Ten, which is by far the best volleyball conference in the country. Maybe they'll be battle tested. Maybe they have some time to find some things. But I think the ACC is every bit the Big Ten's peer in volleyball now. And it has Pitt and it has Louisville, which is the other big national title threat. So, Penn State's going to have to find a lot to beat either one of those teams if they're even lucky enough to make it to the Final Four this season. So certainly another Penn State storyline to monitor on the same track or on a different track than football. Joel, anything else this week before we wrap up?
No, I think that's pretty much it. Yeah, I mean, I would just say I'm expecting a big blowout this week from Penn State.
Will they cover? I think that was last I looked, the line was 49. Let's just say 49.5 for the sake of easy numbers. No pushes here. Do they cover 49.5?
I'm hesitant, but I'll say yes. And it goes back to a few things. A lot of it kind of depends on Penn State's history. I mean, I saw that anytime Penn State's been a 40-plus point favorite under James Franklin, they've covered pretty easily. I think the last time was a 62-0 win over UMass last year. And so you kind of look at Franklin's track record with that. You can also look at their record against the spread the last few years. And it almost feels like Franklin's kind of aware of what the spread is. It almost feels like he's trying to cover, because we've seen a few times now where Penn State will score in the last few minutes of a game to kind of get, the extra points needed to cover the spread. So it almost feels like they're kind of making that a goal or trying to cover the spread. Obviously, he fell way short against Bowling Green last week, but this week against Kent State, I think if they have the chance to cover, they will. And it's actually, I believe, the same spread that Tennessee had last week against Kent State when they won 71-0. So I think, you can kind of expect more of the same from Penn State here. I think, you're looking at probably sometime in the third quarter, you should be hitting, that 50-ish mark and then kind of cruising into the finish. So really what it comes down to is, can Ethan Grunkemeyer get that, 8th touchdown for you to cover or whatever it is. So it's a little bit hard to predict just because, you're not sure the circumstances and if Penn State's going to let his foot off the gas. But kind of given Franklin's track record, I think he will try and, get the team over that number.
Yeah, I agree. I think they'll cover as well. And I think it'll be a big number, one of the bigger numbers we've seen in recent years. Because, again, I think this is one of the worst teams they've faced on their schedule in some time. Joel, thanks for joining me this week. Everyone else, please stay tuned to the channel for the rest of the week. We got lots more on Friday with the North Shore Drive Christopher Carter previewing Steelers-Chargers, the home opener this weekend at Acrisure Stadium. I will be back with Paul Zeiss after the game on Sunday for our post-game live stream. So make sure you subscribe. Make sure you like this video if you enjoyed it. Help us out in the YouTube algorithm. We always appreciate that, especially here on the Penn State side, because we kind of get buried in all the Steelers content. So help us out when you can, and we will look forward to talking to you again next week.
Thank you for checking out this content from Post-Gazette Sports. If you watch this video on YouTube, please like the video and subscribe to our channel. For all of the sports coverage the Post-Gazette has to offer, visit post-gazette.com.